In the previous lecture, I addressed the question of the nature of the relationship between mental and physical events that might be plausibly defended in attempts to close the explanatory gap. I noted then that causal relationships are serious candidates, but that these also face serious problems. It is customary to expect in any causal relationship that the antecedent consequent events, or as we might say, the causes and effects, will be of a kindred sort. The stock example is that of two billiard balls colliding. We're prepared to accept action at a distance, such as the effect of the moon's gravitational field on earthly tides. But the moon is a big object, not too far away in astrological distance. It would be expected to have the same sort of effect on water that gravitational fields have on other kinds of physical bodies. In other words, although one might think of gravitational effects as representing or illustrating action at a distance, it's an action that takes place between two indisputably physical bodies. Can the same be said of mental causation? Does my desire and my decision to raise my arm cause my arm to be raised? If so, am I to understand this causal relationship as one that obtains between, on the one side of the cause-effect relation, a massless, spaceless mental event, and on the other side, the movement of a physical mass from one location to another? At a common sense level, one is likely to be perplexed by the claim that mental causes pose a serious problem. What could be more obvious than that the things we think about have the power to bring about the things we choose to do? Philip decides that it's too hot for hot chocolate and proceeds to fix himself an iced tea. If we observe Philip as he proceeds to boil water, take tea bags from the cupboard, slice the lemons, and carry the sugar bowl to the table where he has placed a tall glass, we have no doubt about what he's doing, and we have no doubt but that he planned all this, as we might say, in his mind, prior to moving himself and his limbs in ways that would bring this all about. Now, the only alternative explanation would be that we're watching someone in a sleepwalk. Now, all this pertains to third-person accounts, that is, accounts where we're watching the behavior of someone else and making inferences about what might be going on in that person's mind. The first-person account is transparently simple. I decided that it's too hot for hot chocolate, and I proceed to make myself a glass of iced tea. Now, unless I'm suffering from some serious neurological or psychiatric disorder, the question will never occur to me as to whether what I'm doing was planned and governed by my own mind. If I asked why I was doing these things, I would reply that I had decided to have iced tea. I'd think it quite odd if I were then asked how such a decision could actually make parts of my body move. Again, except under conditions of illness, our actions quite faithfully follow our decisions, and our decisions are quite clearly not material objects. At the common sense level, and in the ordinary affairs of life, we simply take for granted that the plans and purposes shaped within our own mental life causally bring about actions capable of realizing those very plans and purposes. Considered philosophically, however, this state of affairs is highly perplexing, and considered scientifically, it seems virtually nearly impossible. What the common sense account requires is for something mental, which is to say something immaterial, to set in motion large muscle masses and large skeletal frames, and to guide these through complex, delicate, and coordinated series of movements. One option available to us, if we seek to get out of this bind, is simply to attach ourselves to a form of physicalism and insist that decisions, judgments, plans, and purposes are simply code words. For what? For physical events in the brain. There are several factors, however, that make this less than an appealing option. If we were to set about to recast all statements that we've customarily made about our plans and purposes, our decisions and judgments, into physicalistic language, our statements would be essentially unintelligible to others. Indeed, they'd probably be unintelligible to us, even as we uttered the sentences. Presumably, we could learn how to translate these physicalistic terms back into the vernacular language, but little would be gained in that case, since the meaningfulness of the utterances would be tied to the very language that, for some reason, we had abandoned in the first place. The entire enterprise would be a nightmare. Think of lining up all the characteristics of physical events and physical objects in the left-hand column of some huge spreadsheet. Now put all of the characteristics of mental events in the right-hand column. And now think of attempting to match something in the left-hand column with such entries on the right as decision-making, judgments of duty, longing for a peaceful life, wanting a chocolate ice cream cone, believing it will be a rainy spring. The matches simply fall apart. Nothing plausibly matches at all. Undaunted, many philosophers have attempted to have their cake and eat it too. Donald Davidson, for example, has long defended the thesis that he labeled anomalous monism. Davidson adopts a monistic ontology which he regards as consistent with the most advanced thinking in science. On this account, there's only one kind of stuff in reality, and that is physical stuff. Nevertheless, the events and processes that we've traditionally regarded as our mental life are not reducible or directly translatable into physical terms and concepts. Here, then, is the anomaly. On Davidson's account, mental events and processes do bring about physical events in just the sense of strict causation. To do this, they must themselves be physical, but of such a nature as to preclude reduction to the terms of the physical sciences. This is anomalous, for we're required to retain a dualistic vocabulary even as we acknowledge a monistic reality. Hence, anomalous monism. Well, perhaps the most obvious criticism of this view is that it permits the very mental properties that make the causal model problematical in the first place. If Davidson is willing to include mental properties and at the same time regard them as irreducible to physical properties, then one has to have an answer to the question, how did these mental properties, these actually veiled physical properties, get caused by the non-veiled physical properties of the brain? It's interesting that Davidson resists the very notion of properties as such, and also resists the conventional view that one thing causes another through some sort of causal mechanism or process requiring identification. Instead, Davidson takes the position that where there is causation, one thing causes another by just causing it. Now, Davidson, I should note, is not alone in his skepticism regarding properties. Some philosophers have argued that properties are themselves simply ensembles of causes. Thus, when we say that water is a universal solvent, we're saying that it causes things to dissolve. So the right inventory of properties on this account is just an inventory of the observed effects things have on other things. How interesting. Well, at this point, it might be timely to consider further just what we mean by properties. What is a mental property, for example? I have rather more confidence in answering questions about physical properties, for one might just list such features of an object as its weight, height, shape, hardness, etc. However, none of these could be meaningfully applied to anything we're inclined to regard as mental. Only metaphorically would we refer to the shape of an argument, or the hardness of one's position, or the height of folly, or of humor that is off color. Before we can prepare any sort of list of mental properties, we have to be clear as to what we mean by mental contents in the first place, or just mental entities. For some X to have properties, there must be an X. For the garden gate to have properties, there must be a garden gate. For there to be mental properties, there must be something mental. What might the mental items be which in some way bear certain properties? Perhaps the most obvious ones are experiences and thoughts. By experiences, I refer to our perceptions. When I perceive a red rose, I could say, in a somewhat cumbersome fashion, that I am having the experience associated with the perception of a red rose, or an experience of the sort normally brought about when I am looking at a red rose under proper conditions of illumination and with a visual system that is functioning in a proper way. I'm not sure about how to convert all this into a mental property, however, for surely in perceiving a red rose, I'm not having a red experience or a red idea. Rather, I'm recording one of the objective facts of the object in front of me, namely that it's red. In this case, the property of redness is assigned to the rose, not to the mental activity or the perception. Suppose instead the experience is that of pain. Again, it would seem to be unnecessary and somewhat distracting to say something like, I am having the experience of a toothache. It's generally sufficient to say, I have a toothache. We're all familiar with aches and pains. Except in the philosophy literature, however, these are not regarded as mental events, but as unpleasant sensations occurring in various regions of one's body. In the matter of certain pains, the neurophysiological details have been fairly accurately, even completely worked out. Heightened activity in the unmyelinated C fibers and sensory nerves are reliably associated with reported pain. As the signals are transmitted to the regions of the brain, it is even possible to block them physically and thus avert a pain that would otherwise naturally occur. The relationship is so reliable here that by the usual standards, we seem to be on sure footing in saying that discharges in the C fibers and resulting activity in specific regions of the brain causally bring about pain. We might go further and say that a relationship obtains between the degree of activity in the relevant areas of the brain and the intensity of the pain. Now, the intensity of pain is one of its properties. To that extent, we can say that a specific physical property, namely activity in the relevant areas of the brain, causally brings about a specific mental property, namely intensity of pain. Let us go a step further and record the reliable relationship between the presence of intense pain and the rapid movement of one's hand away from the flame. At this point, at least in principle, we have a rich catalog of pain properties and a comparable catalog of neurophysiological events reliably related to these. But how does this, or any similar observation, settle the problem we began with, namely, the problem of mental causation? We still have the problem of accounting for how it is that a given physical property causes the experience of pain. The problem of accounting for how it is that the experience of pain, the sensation, the mental event, so to speak, causes the hand to be withdrawn. When we think about this further, yet another question arises, not unlike questions we confronted in connection with zombies in the first lecture in this series. From a design point of view, it should be quite easy to construct a device that moves away from sources of stimulation that have a destructive effect on it or any part of it. It's not at all clear that the experience of pain adds much by way of survival value. After all, many of our self-protective reactions take place at the level of reflexes and require no consciousness whatever, let alone a definite experience. Is it not just excess baggage, adding conscious experience to all the apparatus, already sufficient to produce self-protective behavior? I'll not consider this question just yet. Let me turn instead to still another class of mental events, in this case, thoughts. All thought is thought about something, by which I mean that thought has content. What we think about need not have real existence, of course. For several centuries, the European hierarchy set out to identify, prosecute, and even execute witches, thinking them to be heretics. We must assume that many officials at the time were obsessed with thoughts of witches, though as it happens, there simply aren't actual witches. Again, that thought has content is not to say that such content is invariably real. There is a somewhat misleading term in philosophy for the contents of thought, for what thoughts are about. They are referred to as intentional objects, here meaning not the specific intention to do something, but the tendency of all mental acts toward an object. When the watchman claims he saw a witch flying over the church steeple, we need a term for what was seen. As there was no witch, and therefore none flying over the steeple, we say that in this instance, the witch was an intentional object in the watchman's mind or thought. This intentionality is of central importance to our consideration of mental causation. The term itself has medieval roots in its philosophical heritage. The Latin intentio in scholastic philosophy refers to one's conception of something, which may or may not match up with reality. In more modern times, it was the philosopher-psychologist Franz Brentano who drew attention to one of the identifying features of what we've been referring to as the mental. Whether the activity is that of perceiving, desiring, remembering, feeling, knowing, believing, or intending, it is always about something. It is the aboutness of these mental activities that is so special. Brentano put it this way, quote, "Every mental phenomenon includes something as object within itself, although they do not do so in the same way. In presentation, something is presented. In judgment, something is affirmed or denied. In love, loved. In hate, hated. In desire, desired, and so on. This intentional inexistence is characteristic exclusively of mental phenomena. No physical phenomenon exhibits anything like it. We can therefore define mental phenomena by saying that they are those phenomena which contain an object intentionally within themselves." Close quote. Brentano draws the sharp dividing line between all that is mental and all that is physical. The former is always about something, and the latter never is. Could a dichotomy be any sharper? Sodium chloride is salt, but it isn't about anything. That tastes salty is about something. It's about what I'm tasting. There are no desires without content, nor are there hopes without something for which we hope, nor is there knowledge except that which knowledge is about. In these and kindred cases, what is presupposed is one who knows, one who hopes, one who feels, one who thinks, one who is experiencing something. Now let us be clear on what this dichotomy seems to indicate about the issue of mental causation. If the objects of mental events are intentional objects, which is to say, if the objects of mental events are always about something, whereas physical objects do not have this feature or property, we are then left with the question of how any physical feature or property could give rise to the very aboutness of thoughts, feelings, knowledge, etc. Similarly, the question arises as to how mental events, which are about something, causally bring about events that are physical and utterly lacking in this very property. Now, let me not be overly metaphysical on this point. I mean only to raise a question about the extent to which causally related objects and events would be expected, what sort of relationship we'd expect them to have, and that would be at least one property in common between them. The common property may not be as obvious as the comparable masses of two billiard balls, but there should be something, if only something spatio-temporal, shared by causes and their effects. Is it possible that in these respects we're really asking for too much? Some have suggested that causal explanations are of a rather exotic sort, and that we might just content ourselves with ordinary forms of explanation. When we say that objects fall toward the center of the Earth because they're under the influence of gravitational forces, we take that to be an explanation. Now, to press on and ask further, well, just what is it in gravity that is the source of this force, would lead to an infinite regress. Let's say that the source of gravitational forces is something called a graviton. Well, then we'd have to ask, what is it about gravitons that have them create effects of the sort we've observed ad infinitum? About a decade ago, the philosopher George Ray set down an interesting maxim in a book devoted to philosophy of mind. He called it a fairness maxim, and he expressed it in these words: "Don't burden the mind with everyone else's problems. Always ask whether a problem is peculiar to the mind, or whether the issue could equally well be raised in other less problematic areas. If it can be, settle it for those areas first, and then assess the philosophy of mind." Close quote. Well, this ties in nicely with the notion of customary explanations as containing the causal conditions within themselves. When I say that Nick drove to the store to buy a quart of milk, it would be odd if someone then asked me by what mechanism all this was brought about. And in fact, it would be impossible to provide a completely causal account of everything that had to be accomplished. Except for the metaphysically cranky, most would accept the proposition that the causal account is just included in the statement that Nick drove to the store to buy a quart of milk. And if I say that as a result of Mary's thirst, she went to the fridge and poured a glass of milk, most native speakers will understand that the cause of Mary going to the fridge was her thirst. Some will regard this approach as nothing less than philosophical surrender. Critics might say that a strategy of this sort would conveniently solve all the problems that philosophy is ever likely to confront. Present a problem and the solution is to insist that that's just the way things are. But I do think this misses the point. The central task of any discipline, once it has mapped out its territory, is to arrive at a settled position on just how far its explanatory resources are likely to take it. To stretch these resources beyond their intrinsic powers is actually to abandon the discipline itself and perhaps to enter another and quite different discipline. This has become all too apparent within philosophy of mind. In raising the very question of mental causation, the philosopher has moved from a philosophical question to a scientific question, though it may be as intractable in science as it proved to be in philosophy. Is it any surprise that the philosopher asking what at base is a scientific question soon discovers the inability of philosophical modes of explanation to settle it? In the present context, I would submit that questions of causation are in principle and always scientific questions. But I would go further than this. I would say that much of what we do in the ordinary affairs of life is not to be understood in causal terms. Much of what we do in the ordinary affairs of life, we have a reason for doing. I would have the concept of reasons here understood fairly broadly. By having a reason, I submit that the person acting has some end or goal in mind, some set of rational desires and motives, some condition or state of need calling for a particular course of action. Having a reason to act generally brings about an action. The actual record of human activities, since the time such records have been kept, leaves no doubt at all but that the primary antecedent conditions for actions are reasons. We have well-developed psychiatric categories for persons whose actions bear no intelligible connection to the reasons they claim to be moved by, or for that matter to any reasons at all. Needless to say, there's much work to be done both in psychology and in philosophy on the question of just how reasons and actions match up. When viewed at a metaphysically safe distance, however, it would seem strange to ask just how a reason for acting causes the actions intelligibly related to it. There is still more to say about all this. To act for a reason, or to act with a reason, is to engage the larger world. Indeed, it is to see the world in a certain aspect. The action now is tied to an understanding of the surrounding environment and what it affords by way of possibilities for acting. Having the same reason, but finding oneself in a radically different environment, might call for radically different courses of action. Having nothing but a shopping bag and finding oneself in the middle of a rainstorm may lead to the shopping bag now converted to a makeshift umbrella. The point I wish to make here is that causal accounts drawn from the much more orderly world of physical objects in motion soon prove to be far too thin and far too limited when we attempt to bring them into the busy, cluttered, noisy, sometimes unfathomable world of real life as actually lived. Are causes and reasons fundamentally different? Mustn't reasons be a species of cause if reasons are able to bring about actions? Now, to require such a connection, however, is to adopt the very physicalistic perspective that a reasons account challenges. As of now, we are strongly inclined to regard all instances of motion and activity as candidates for explanations based on physical causes. Some might say that this is the metaphysically correct assumption. However, it may also be false. There will always be more to learn about the nervous system, I am sure, but we do know a great deal. I would go so far as to say that 90% of what we know has been learned in the course of my own lifetime. This impressive growth of knowledge has nonetheless left the problem of mental causation pretty much where it was in the time of the ancient Greek philosophers. I do not offer this observation to justify total surrender. It should, however, have something of a chastening effect on those who insist that the problem of mental causation is just a technical problem, ultimately to be settled through scientific progress and the proper application of experimental methods. As for the claim that we know very little about causality in any area, and therefore should not expect much more when it comes to mental life, I would submit that ignorance in one domain may be based on factors quite different from the ignorance we suffer in a quite different domain. To say that my friend is ignorant of the birthday present I've bought for him is to say something different from my friend being ignorant as to how his desires cause his body to move. The first form of ignorance will be removed by a fact, and that fact will appear sometime on the day of his birthday. As of now, there is no compelling reason to believe that some set of facts will remove that second kind of ignorance on any birthday. We stay tuned, of course, even during long periods of static. Well, as if all this were not vexing enough, consider the basis upon which we have any right to conclude that there are minds other than our own. Well, are there other minds? Tune in next time.